Hi, everybody. So to start off today's talk, I wanted to say thank you so much for being here. I am experiencing really intense brain fog today, so I wish and hope for everybody to bear with me. My words might be a little bit jumbled. I'm trying my best, but I'm having one of those days, and I know for other people who are disabled in the crowd, I'm sure you get it. But welcome to Accessible Roots Grow a Healthy Framework. You are at WebAIMConf, and it is September 8th, apparently. I like to start my talks with a roadmap. So we're going to start with an introduction, move into the concept of growing healthy roots, and then a life cycle of a component where it's kind of like I'm a Bill. We're going to walk through the component life cycle and how it applies to accessibility, and then wrap up with a conclusion. On the timeline, everything's pretty evenly spaced. I would say like 2 is kind of at the at the 1/4, and then we've got 3 is kind of in the middle, but they're pretty well spaced out. So that's an expectation of today's content. Before I get going on any content, I wanted to take a moment to do Indigenous land acknowledgement. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am presenting to you today on the unceded ancestral lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. If you'd like to learn more about the native Indigenous lands that you are currently on, check out native-land.ca. And for those of you who are in Seattle, please feel free to check out Real Rent Duwamish from their website. Real Rent calls on people who live and work in Seattle to make rent payments to the Duwamish tribe. Through the city is named the Duwamish leader, Chief Seattle Thrives, the tribe leader has yet to be justly compensated for their lands, resources, and livelihood. If you would like to stand in solidarity with these first people, please feel free to check out this website. And with that, let's get started. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Shell Little. My gender pronouns are she and her. You can find me on Twitter at Shell E Little. If you have anything you like about this talk, please feel free to tweet at me, tag me. I will try my best to get through the tweets. I'm currently on burnout recovery. I am chilling out, but I do continue to speak. In general about me, I am an accessibility specialist and I'm an inclusive designer. When I do speaking, I do a lot of disability and cognitive speaking. I do a lot of disability DE and I. I can be hired. I do corporate speaking and private gigs for that. So if that's something you're interested in your company. I also talk about accessible design and game accessibility. So I'm in Seattle. I am partnered, and my kids all have tails. So for those of you who do know me and have heard me present before, this is kind of a different topic for me. Typically what I like to do is I like to find a pattern that pisses me off or find something that ticks me off and really hone in on it. So we're talking one tree in the forest, but this talk is about systems and process, which I don't normally talk about. And we're looking at the entire forest when I'm used to just staring at one tree. So, keep that in mind. Process is not something that I know infinite amounts of information about, but I am here to share kind of my personal experience in a system that worked really well. So what is this talk? Well, first of all, this talk isn't how to audit your component library. If you're looking for that, I recommend Anna Cook has a wonderful talk from 2021 at what conference was that? I have too many conferences in my brain. It was AxCon. I'm not going to talk about how to get buy-in, like how to convince people to use your framework. I'll talk about it a little bit, but that's not the point of this talk. It's also not to talk about how to write your accessible specs. That's not it either. But what this talk is a review of a system that worked well. Accessibility was integrated into this workflow, and an overview of the life cycle of a component to see what does that actually look like. Because we hear a lot, you should do this, but I would like to actually show what it looks like. And then advice on maintaining an accessible design system. So those are kinds of the information that you can expect today for today's talk. But when I talk about this, like, what does this actually look like? What does actually making things accessible and integrated look like? That's what I'm hoping to talk about today. A little bit, we'll see. But I am excited to share some examples from the previous role that I had. I did work in fintech at a Fortune 500 company. If you want to know, just look it up. So I'm taking the experiences I had at that program and sharing them today because I don't work there anymore and I can do that. So I'm really excited to just talk about the work that I did for 5-6 years. So start off with the definition. What is a design system? Just in general, a design system is a set of deliverables. It's a source of truth that allows a team to design and develop a product, site, or experience at scale by reducing redundancy and ensuring visual consistency. So that's just a design system. Things that can go into a design system, like type of deliverables, component libraries, which holds all the documentation about components, component APIs, which is a functioning component example, design standards, which is brands, colors, fonts, that kind of stuff, and then pattern libraries, where you can see everything functioning together. All of those components work together to make what we would call a design system. So how do you bake in accessibility into a framework? Well, you do it by having an inclusive designer working in the system. So you do it by having somebody who does inclusive design work and they're involved in all the changes, updates to any components, patterns, or interactions. That's basically it. You just have to have someone in there doing the job, doing the work. Because when we take accessibility and we think about making accessible components, so the component itself, the patterns around it are all accessible, that ends up making an accessible framework. So when people consume that framework, they're consuming already accessible components. Then we're able to make accessible designs because we've already set the foundation for accessible components, accessible patterns, and that what we end up with is accessible products. So it's all about starting at the root. So a quick example is we had a project that found themselves unable to ship due to accessibility issues. They had 111 defects that were outstanding for accessibility that stopped them from shipping. And these are high and critical defects that will hold a project back from shipping. And they had done their own code base. They did their own thing. They realized they were in hot water because they just didn't have the handle on accessibility. They switched over to our framework code base, and 56% of the defects just closed because of the switch in the code base. So when you think about accessibility at a root level, this shows, we had great success with this one where they moved over, and by the time they integrated all three phases of these pages, they were 100% compliant with our outstanding issues. So it's worth the time. It does make a difference. Awesome. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're good. So section 2, growing healthy roots. So we're going to talk about a couple different, topics on frameworks, but also talk about some myths as well. So first things first, service design. So the biggest misunderstanding in a design system is that we forget that we are it's a product that we're making and people are consuming it. So it's a big misunderstanding. People forget that we're a product and it needs to be accessible to those who are consuming it in general. So when we're making products, we're thinking about our end user, but when you're working internally and working on a framework, your product owners, your other applications are your consumer. And it's really important to not forget that it's a service at that point. You need the people who are using your thing to understand it, to want to understand it, to have a grasp on what you're building. So things that we did to make sure that people were understanding and consuming our products was we did surveys of cross-functional members. We talked to every single person that could potentially touch our framework and got feedback. And we compiled all that feedback and did some big UX exercises. We did thorns and roses. We did Kanban boards. We did, high lows and tried to look at all of these functional points and group them together and say, where are the pain points that people are experiencing here? And what is really important about that is when you are removing the barriers for people to access your framework and you're already building accessibility in, that way people can access it and spread the accessibility. They have access to, documentation and everything, but it's really important to remember that it's a service and you need to listen and gather pain points on your framework. So for the first myth, once the design system is finished, you're all set for accessibility needs. So someone could just go in, help you work on all the accessibility, and then they can leave, and it's good to go. You're set for accessibility. Well, that's not true because context is everything for accessibility. You'll constantly be finding new ways people want to use your components that you never thought about. So someone needs to be there to make sure that everything that's being done is accessible and all the patterns that are being brought in are accessible. And standards and understandings as we know it about what's accessible and what's not accessible, it's always changing. The bar is always moving. So we need to be constantly evolving. It's I like to say that a design system is living and breathing. You can't just consider anything. It's not done. There is no done. Every change made to the design system should be checked for accessibility impacts. It's amazing. You wouldn't think, a simple color change or a simple outline change or a simple, change in the way we underline things, something as simple as that could have really big ripple effects for the accessibility of different applications, products, services. So for myth number 2, the framework shouldn't enforce standards. Only product teams are responsible for standards. Now, this one's kind of spicy, but this is something I strongly believe in. We should never expect other teams to have the same level of accessibility understanding when it comes to design systems. So if we have the power to stop as many issues as happening as possible, it is our responsibility as a framework to do that, as a design system to do that, to build standards in place that say, no, you cannot use this component this way, or, this functionality cannot be used in XYZ, writing those standards and making it so people understand how a component should be used and putting a cap on whatever thing can be done. I always joke that when it comes to building components, we will give product team a rowboat and they book a cruise on it. So you got to be sure you're thinking about all the use cases. And we're covering those concerns and building accessibility into the roots of the system. It makes it scale, which is really important. Awesome. Documentation. Moving on to documentation, the best chance at educating those who are using your framework and accessibility is documentation. That's talking about component specs, clean code samples. We did demo videos of all the components with different assistive technology so people could always reference it. Accessibility is cooked into the cross-disciplinary items. So accessibility doesn't just exist in a vacuum. When we think about accessible design, we're also thinking about things like interaction design and content, what's being done there. What content goes into an element can change the accessibility drastically. Are you putting links into something that a keyboard user couldn't get to fast enough? So now you have to make sure those links have to be redundant, those kinds of things. So making sure they're all cooked in. Myth number 3, you don't need robust accessibility documentation on components and patterns. Strongly disagree with that because every change is an opportunity to share knowledge. People don't like because I said so. People like to know the heart and the work that went into it. When we started putting that information in, we got a lot of changed minds of being like, oh, I understand because you did all this work to get there, instead of just saying we made the change, that's what we did. The people who need your documentation will consume it. Someone who's wondering, why the heck is it this way? They're going to dig in, they're going to read your documentation. And don't assume the team will remember anything with turnover. So if you made a change, make sure that's documented because in 2 years, in 3 years, you're going to be glad you did. Awesome. Transparency. Allow people to understand how the process works. It's critical. If people understand what's going on to their requests, it helps everything involved. So we had to basically go through a rebrand to help people understand what process was going on behind the curtain. People would say that framework was where tickets went to die. But through being more transparent, we had so much better collaboration and we got so much more work done when people knew what was going on with their tickets, knew where we were in the process. So having meetings with teams who have requests out, touching base with them, gathering concerns and ideas from all teams, and updating greater teams regarding progress. So for myth number 4, accessibility is a bottleneck in the component lifecycle. Well, no, accessibility is a part of the process, not an additional piece. So when it's cooked into the process, there's no point for accessibility to be bottlenecking the process. If it's spread across key members, you're good. And open communication regarding status about accessibility is really important. So for this, we basically made sure that there's a touch point everywhere for accessibility. And instead of handing somebody, here's a finished product, please check the accessibility, that's when it becomes a bottleneck. So bottlenecking isn't the fault of accessibility, it's the fault of the process. Moving on to education. Educating the customer or the consumers of your design system is the most important thing you can do. If they don't know how to use it, they can't consume it. So having training sessions, open hours, educational presentations, talk about changes and why they're happening, listen to pain points. So anytime there was an accessibility change to any of the framework components, it was my responsibility to talk to QA, make sure the design team understood what was going on. And if it was a large change, talk about it with the greater group at all hands. So making sure that we're educating people continuously. So for myth number 5, documentation is enough to demonstrate components in a pattern library. But what we found is that working examples were worth every second they were spent. So API pages, they are way better than documentation oftentimes, because we found that all of our designers were relying on our live API pages. So when there was a mistake in an API page that didn't match the specs, we kept finding it in the wild. And when we finally figured out it's because on our API page, we were able to make that change. And functional pattern libraries are great as well. So for myth number 6, framework libraries are the silver bullet of accessibility concerns. I've heard that too many times. So what I always said is we can make the puzzle pieces and components of the library accessible. You can put them together, but you're not guaranteed to have a picture. That's the job of the inclusive designer or an accessible designer, to sit down and make sure that those components, those puzzle pieces, are being put together in a way that makes sense. It's the importance of those accessible designers. They're critical. Cool. Moving on to life cycle of a component. So this is the second half. So for those of you who remember, I'm just a component. I have a picture on the screen right now of Bill from I'm Just a Bill from Schoolhouse Rock, which I thought was kind of funny. So on the screen right now, I have I think there's 7 steps. 3, 4, 5, 6, there's 7 of this component tracking and planning lifecycle. And so first of all, we're going to talk about a team has a request. They need a new component. They need something new. So what we would do is first we start off with a feature request. So they would enter their feature request into a board for us, like on a Jira board or any ticketing board would work. Then there's a first review to make sure, like, oh, answer any questions. Oh, maybe you're thinking of this other component. Hey, actually, we've already said no to this component in the past. Here's why. That kind of first review. Then if it gets past the first review, then we talk about cross-functional review. And that's a space where we can all ask questions, bounce ideas off of each other, make sure that we are, nipping things in the bud before they become a problem. Then we've got design sprint, where that's the iteration of moving through design sprints, code sprints, QA sprints, and then we ship. So let's dig a little bit into these. So first off, feature request. So a feature request for us was any change request for a component, a net new component, or a request for a new feature. It's accepted via ticket. So it was a designated intake area. So we didn't miss important things like important accessibility issues or important changes that need to be made. People felt heard because they could put their tickets, they had somewhere to go, someone would respond to it. It really helped with the morale there. And then it allows teams to start the process and not put the pressure on the framework to try to track all those things. So the story I'll be telling is about Toast. I'm tight on time, so I can't go into too much detail, but for example, I worked on a Toast component. On the screen, I just have a Toast image of a toast. They're all kind of just decorative. But I will say shout out to Sherry Bryan-Haber though, because I use that I use that article a ton. So I do have an article posted on the bottom. But a team had expressed a need for a message component. They discussed it amongst themselves and then they put a feature request in for that component. So it started the process of us thinking, okay, Toast. Okay, we think we need Toast. So moving on to first review, a team member would review those tickets and assign them accordingly. Questions can be answered and suggestions given. So, hey, actually, you're thinking of this one, or I think you think you want this pattern, but actually you don't. So it's kind of like that first line of defense. So it allows us to direct people to the correct component if they were confused. We can educate people. We can nip the hard nose in the bud, like that's never going to happen. And we can chat with the team to understand things better. So with Toast, we saw the request and had a chance to ask what the need is, talk with the teams, understand more what the use cases are. And after that, we were like, okay, let's push forward with Toast. Next up is cross-functional review. So tickets that are made, they make it through, are then discussed further, reviewing possible issues, blockers, or red flags. So this was a huge one because this is the chance for cross-disciplinary teams to sit down. And I can ask questions to dev and be like, hey, I have concerns about X, Y, Z. And they can be like, nope, don't worry about it. Or, hey, is this possible? And they're able to answer back. It was really important. We got a ton of great work done in deciding whether a ticket or whether a change should be made. So all the teams get a chance to discuss. We all sit down together. And it leaves space for further questions to be answered. So we are able to say, okay, these are the 4 outstanding questions that we need answered before we can move forward. So it worked really well as a good process. So for Toast, we all had a chat as a team. We decided if it was a viable option or not. It sounded like it was. So Dev, they brought some concerns. The scope seemed too small, like what we needed to make it accessible and functional. It didn't look like we had the scope to do that. So things started to feel a little bit off. Next up is design sprints. So teams begin discovery. Then they move into design iterations. Updates are frequent and cross-functional meetings are held. So this is an important part for me as the inclusive design lead, because what I would do is I begin discovery. I look for any issues. Are these super easy peasy patterns that have been documented? Are they sticky patterns that have some issues? It gave me the chance to understand the scope and work with the other designers as they are producing things to make sure that what they're producing is accessible and what they're producing is good. So this was a huge part to make sure that accessibility was really cooked in. I was doing my research. I was working with wireframes, working with the designers to make sure that all interaction design was good. We didn't have concerns on, things like what kind of content will we allow. So for Toast, the discovery began reading articles and testing other patterns and talking to other subject matter experts. I had a concern about a lot of things at the time. We had issues with content. What kind of content can you put in Toast, which is there's a lot of rules for it. About functionality, what happens if you get bombarded with Toast messages? And then timing, how are we going to deal with timing adjustable? So a lot of concerns start to bubble up. Next is code sprint. So devs take the designs and they begin making our accessible dev would take that and start making clean, simple accessibility code for functionality. Many iterations are done. This is where I would work with my teammate to ensure that the sample code matches the interaction design and all the concerns that I have, answer functionality questions, and review code for the rest of the team. So with Toast, the problem is that the prototypes were being made and things just didn't seem to work out. Issues are being found in the accessible code. We couldn't quite get it where it was going, but the timeline, one second. Good. Okay. Hopefully I can still be heard. Awesome. Thank you. My headset likes to do that. Anyway, but we started to find issues with this and the concerns started rising. But at this point, we didn't put the flags up on time. So things kind of kept moving forward. QA sprints. So at this point, typically all specs, all spec work is finished, functionality and alpha examples, and they test by QA, and bugs and issues are documented, sorted, and fixed. So at this point, we're working with QA on any accessibility concerns. We're working on that with everything to say, maybe this pattern doesn't work right. Maybe the screen reader's acting up to try to figure out what's going on. We see if there's gaps in our specs. So if they're flagging something as a defect, but it was just spec'd wrong, that's a great chance to catch those things. And it helps us assist in the high level questions. Like if it's a big problem, they bring me in, but smaller problems can be handled by our QA because QA is awesome. But with Toast, the code samples and prototypes were being tested by the accessibility team. It wasn't seeming right. QA begins to look at the examples and they're kind of concerned, and concerns rise as term as scope. Basically, what I found out was we can't have Toast without Toast Rack, a place where those messages go to live. And it was found out too late in the process. So we were already blazing forward towards alpha. So last but not least, shipping. Actually, let's see how we're doing on time. W2. Oh, actually, we're doing great on time. Cool. For shipping. So for shipping the component, typically we just move it to live. The specs are updated and posted, and that's where the education begins. When you ship a component, it's not job done. It's education begins on what's the component, what are the changes, why were they made, where can you find this information? So this is discussing accessibility changes with the design team. So I would go into the design team's all hands and say, hey, here's our new component, here's what's going on, here is why we made these changes, and educating them on the components being changed and why they were being changed. And then sharing anything with the QA team. So weekly met with the QA team to say, hey guys, you'll notice that our toggle switch, which used to have a requirement to have labels on both sides, no longer has that requirement because now we're using it for progressive disclosure purposes. So it's no longer a form element, it's just an element of the page. So it doesn't need to have on-off labels on it. So if you see that, don't flag it as a defect, it is okay. Those kinds of conversations. And then we're educating the UX department on the updates as well. So at all hands. So everybody's on the same page about why these changes are being made. No one feels frustrated or I don't understand why you guys got rid of that thing. It's all very clear and transparent. But with Toast, so the component was already in alpha and it was in an incomplete state. Timelines were tight and we didn't have a ton of time for revisions. And finally, I had to pull the plug. I had to push the red button. And this is a big fail. We had a huge failure here because we didn't stick to the plan of making sure things are done before it moves on, halting and pushing timelines. We just kind of all ran with it. And it was everybody's fault, but my fault as well. And Toast had to be pulled from alpha, and it was a big thing, but the team was supportive. Everybody understood that we can't ship something that's inaccessible, so we didn't ship it, and we pulled back. And what we did is we learned from our mistakes and we made the process even better than it was before. So we communicated with our product teams to explain super complicated why we can't have toast messages without a place for them to go live because of timing adjustable. There's a ton of accessibility concerns with toast, especially if the product teams are wanting to use toast for more than it should be used for. So if it's just a simple like you sent your email, that's less of a concern than people trying to put links in it and trying to put important information in there. We need to have somewhere where those messages go and live, especially if someone wants to just turn toast off, just send it straight to that message area. I don't want to be disrupted. There were a lot of concerns. So we sent out wider communications to explain what happened. And then we had a postmortem to talk about the failure. And what we did to avoid this in the future is we put a mandatory stop between alpha and our testing. So we need to make sure that in the prototype stage, everybody feels comfortable. So we added another approval process onto the testing portion, and it made a really big difference for us, because that way the next time we had a component that was kind of like more stuff kind of came out as we were working on it, we saw the signs and we were able to stop it before it got as far as it did, which was great. Everybody felt more empowered to voice concerns earlier on in the middle, especially like there's that like sunk cost fallacy. I think that's kind of where I was at. I was like, well, we've already done so much work. Like it's almost there. It's almost there. Instead of stopping and reflecting and being like, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to work. We need to go back to the drawing board, and we need to do more research. So moving forward from this toast example, our process got streamlined and it was way better than it was before. So it's really, really, really important to fail. And it's really, really, really important to talk about failure, because we were able to streamline our process and make sure we had stop gaps, and we made sure we had safety nets for if things did go awry. We have a team who's expecting a component, they need it to ship their product, and we're struggling to figure out if it's even feasible. We need to figure that out way ahead of time so the product team has time. So, it was something we had to kind of like eat it, I guess. And but in the end, it was good. It was a really good experience in failure, and it was also a really good experience in support from your team, because having to go on a team and say, hi, we have to pull this component is really scary, but to be met by understanding because your team is full of people who care about accessibility, it's a really great feeling to everybody goes, no, accessibility is important. We can't ship it without it being ready to go. We can't call our framework accessible if we have inaccessible components. So yeah, it was a good learning experience. So in conclusion, I'm running a little bit early, which is great because time is a construct. But in conclusion, to have an accessible design system, you need accessibility designers involved in every step of the process. So you need people who are working behind the scenes in all decisions that are being made. When it comes to me as a designer, when I'm thinking about accessibility, I am thinking about interaction design is like the biggest thing that comes up for accessible design for me is interaction design. What is it doing? Once you get the base level, like color contrast and like the really basic accessibility stuff done, then you're dealing with the harder questions, like, for example, what kind of content can live in toast? What does the interaction look like? How long should the timer be? Like that's interaction design, and accessible interaction design is huge. So when you have somebody who's thinking about those things, you're able to cook accessibility into everything you do, into the content, into the design, into the colors, into everything that goes into making a product. 2, design systems are a product, and you can't slack on the service side of your product if you hope it to scale. No one's going to use your product if it's unusable. If no one can access it, if you don't have a place where it lives, if it's not organized, if there's no education, if there's no outreach, people aren't going to use it. And we found the accessibility scaled really well because people knew it was there. They knew it would be easier for them to get through accessibility issues if they just used our stuff. So it was a really positive feedback loop. We pour in really good accessibility, people use it because it's accessible, and it just is a positive feed loop. 3, documentation is your biggest ally when making any changes to a system. The why is just as important as the what. So what changes were made, why you're making those changes. Oh, actually, NVDA had an update, and because of that, it's now accepting the placeholder tag. So now we're having double announcements everywhere that has placeholders. So let's talk about if that's a concern or not. Or, JAWS is doing something and being fussy. as JAWS does every once in a while. And because of that, we need to make a certain change that needs to be documented. So when JAWS does update, or when things do break, we can know, why was that decision made? That was a bad decision, and we'll know, oh, that's why it was made. So remember that the why it's being made is really important, and it keeps your framework healthy, and it keeps it growing. 4, accessible design systems will never be a silver bullet for accessible needs. Accessible designers have their work cut out for them. So we dealt with that a lot, where people were like, oh, if I switch my code base over to you guys, over to the framework, we're done for accessibility. It's a one-to-one. And we had to tell them, no, it's not a one-to-one. Some of the components you were using don't exist anymore, and the patterns you're using aren't accessible. So it's not just switch the code base, it's also redesign the wireframes. And that was hard for a lot of product teams to deal with. Mistakes are critical for learning and growing in this field. We need to share more about processes and bumps along the way. So I hope you learned something from, my failure. I'm proud to talk about it. Failing is a part of life, but it's important that we as accessibility specialists share our fails as much as our wins. Like I've made some bad calls in the past, and I learned from that, and I never made those calls again. And if, we need to reflect on those. So I'd love to hear more about failure, more about what didn't work and what happened because of it. Because at the end of the failure, if you do postmortems, if you do reflect, you can end up with way better stuff than you did before. Well, that's it for me. We have a lot of time for questions. I'm not a huge fan of Q&A, but I'm going to try my best. So go easy on me, my little brain. But thank you so much for being here and for checking this thing out.
Shell, thank you. It's Rob. I thought you brought up some really good points. The sunk cost fallacy, I think, has extended myriad projects, right? Where you just keep going, oh, but we've already done this much. We have to make this work, until you finally back away and realize we have fundamental flaws. And we've just been hammering our head into the wall to try to make this work for months or weeks. So I think that's a really, really good point with accessibility and just in general. There was one point or one question for clarification that I wanted to pose, and that is, what's an API page? Could you describe that a little bit more?
Oh, yeah. An API page is where you can see components functioning live. So it's typically a page where you'll find some documentation on there, but the purpose of it is to see how they function. And they're, like live examples. That's my best explanation. I couldn't give you what the acronym is. I'm sure it's something important.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So need to just post in the chat, since we're in this train of thought. API page, something like Storybook?
I don't know what Storybook is, so
I don't either. Maybe. I can't help. We'll leave that one to Google, possibly.
Yes. Yes.
I think that this. Well, I'll pose the question the way it is here, and if anyone wants to clarify in the chat, it's from an anonymous attendee. If we need clarification, we'll rely on the chat, and we can manage that. But the question is, Shell, could you talk a bit about specifics of training the customer to use the product? How is it done for screen reader users versus other AT users versus the rest of the user base?
Got it. Just to clarify, in my talk, I was never once referring to the consumer as somebody outside of the organization. The consumer that I was referring to was people who are consuming the framework themselves. So that's your product teams. Like, for example, we service over 200 different products who would consume. When it comes to, I don't really know the answer to the question, because it's not what I talk about today, which is totally fine. I would say when it comes to training someone, the best that we could do, the best that I can think of off the top of my head, is making sure that we have resources available on the product that's being produced. So we have support, we have call lines. I know we got, every once in a while, we got calls like from disabled users who were like, hey, I can't use XYZ. And we worked with them to make sure they were able to get through the product. So the best I could say is making sure that there's, like I said, resources, support lines. But I was never a part of training users, who, especially people who use screen readers, to use our actual product. I was too in the weeds.
I think that's fair. I think that this is an interesting question about just the dynamics of these conversations about accessibility within big organizations. The question is, what was your team structure and your general type of work interactions? Could you say final no to the design, stop a planned release if it was not meeting accessibility requirements, for example? And I think you touched on that, but maybe there's a little bit more that you could dig into with the team dynamic.
Yeah, sure. happy to. I actually had to dump those slides because I didn't have time. So happy to use the time I have now to talk about it a little bit. So on the framework team, it consisted of kind of like two separate teams. We had all the designers, so it was inclusive design, content, and then we had interaction design and visual design. So we had people who were in charge of all of those things, typically one person, and then we had a little team of potentially 2 or 3 other people to help assist. And the dev team, we had our dev leads, we had people who we had just had so many brilliant people. We had an accessible, technically he was on my team, but that was where he would sit. And an accessible dev. So their focus was making sure the code was accessible and that, like, our little code snippets worked and in a bare bones example. And then yes, obviously all of our developers as well, really great humans. And then there were people who ran process. So it was the people who they were producers is what we called them, or PMs. And their job was to make sure things were moving, make sure we were staying on track. I owe so much to anybody who does that, to keep people on track on time, keep people keep projects moving, to find and bust any sort of blockers we're having. And then we had people whose job was just to monitor the Jira and monitor tickets. And then we had a whole QA team dedicated to the framework, and we had accessible QA people inside that team. So typically, I worked with, for the most part, when I was working at the framework level stuff, the design team, meeting with the devs, meeting with the people who ran product of, because it's a product. So people who ran the product, and we would go, say, meet with a team who had an ask, and it would be just like 6 of us being like, hey, like, let's talk about it. And we talk about concerns and try to get a better understanding of scope. That's a team that would go. So a lot of handoff, but a lot of teamwork and a lot of meeting together and discussing concerns that, could be, it's a huge concern on my part, but no one else is thinking about it, or dev is really concerned about something. And I was like, oh crap, that affects accessibility as well. We need to be careful on that. That's kind of the dynamic. There was a second half to that question. It was like, what was the team and what was all?
It was, could you say a final no to the design, stop something from being released if it wasn't meeting accessibility requirements?
And yes, the answer is yes. I could stop. As the inclusive design lead, I was able to stop anything at any point. I mean, I had to have reason. I can't just be like, I don't like you. But when I had concern, I was able to stop things from shipping. There were a couple components. I pulled 2 components, but there were several things where, especially by the time it got to the big group review, because I was too busy to be involved in the first couple steps. But when it got to group review, I'd hear about it and I'd say, like, that's not happening. And people would be like, what's going on? I'm like, I don't know, carousel. It's a fake example, but like, it's not going to happen. We're not going to do it. Like, there's UX research that shows it stinks. It stinks for accessibility. I'm not going to mess with it. We're not doing that. And I had the ability to say no, because that's the fun thing about having a team that trusts you, is like, I can give you my 30-minute explanation on how my noodle works and all that's rolling around in here, or you can just trust me. And a lot of times, people want to be educated, but they also just trust me. So it was a good dynamic.
Good, yeah, that's interesting to hear. I don't know how many folks are in that context. There's a question as a follow-up. I don't know if it's a follow-up, but it's definitely related about the QA team. About the QA team, are they trained in accessibility testing, like screen reader testing, et cetera? You kind of touched on this because it sounded like you had some in the QA team that were. Was it really just like you had accessibility QA folks mixed in with the others?
They were dedicated. So they were the dedicated accessibility group. They were trained on how to test with a variety of ATs, including screen readers, tests on mobile. We're doing Zoom magnification. I think that we had a couple more. I think we just started to dip into like Dragon and stuff like that. But yes, we had a dedicated team. Like, that's all they did. They only looked at accessibility tickets. They only opened accessibility bugs. We had a team for QA, and we also had a team for we had a team for framework and a team for projects, if I'm remembering correctly. But yes, I have so much respect for the QA team. They had our backs, we had their backs. It was a great, teamwork thing of being like, hey, someone's giving us a really hard time. Can one of the subject matter experts come? And we'd go to meetings with them and be like, hi, please listen to our QA and respect them. It was like we always had each other's backs. It was a great way to work.
So a little bit different approach from one of the folks out in the audience. What's the criteria of being considered an accessibility designer? Should you be IAAP certified? Is there another benchmark for that?
Yeah, a little bit of a spicy take. I am not a cert person. I think they show dedication. I think that's what certs do. If you want to hear more about how I feel about certs, I am giving a talk about hiring accessible designers. So for me, the benchmark is knowledge. Um, there's a lot of knowledge around how to code accessibly. It is super important work. It is critical for a lot of people. But when it comes to design accessibility, to be considered accessible designer, we're talking about somebody who has the ability to take all of the design related accessibility concerns and look at patterns, look at process, and look like, say, for example, look at a wireframe and go from top to bottom and be like, that's not right. That label isn't right. The Gestalt principles of proximity isn't right. It's not just WCAG, it's past WCAG. It's in the space of where does everything meld together, especially like we're thinking about someone who's deafblind. Like the criteria they need is so different than somebody who's just blind or someone who's just deaf. So for me, it's hard to say a benchmark because like I don't like certs are certs. Like if you want to get a cert, go for it. To me, as somebody who hired for accessible designers for over 5 years, a cert just shows me that you're dedicated to it. It doesn't show me that you have knowledge. Done I've talked to a lot of people who have certs who didn't make the benchmark for me. Should we have an accessible design cert in the future? Maybe, but I don't think we have anything right now that if I see that on someone's resume, I'm like, ooh, they're gonna be good. It's more just about knowledge of patterns and accessibility beyond just standards. It's really hard to just kind of give generalizations about though. Sorry, I tried my best.
No, that's fine. And I think that one of the points that you just made ties into this next one a little bit. So the question from LJ is, how do you counter move fast and break things thinking and assuage folks you're working with that process and documentation is vital?
Oh, that's a hard one because I think it gets to a certain point where your team realizes it's not working. Like move fast, break stuff, it doesn't work. There needs to be thought and consideration. Like if we think about minimal viable product, your MVP has to be accessible. That changes the conversation about move fast and break stuff because people who move fast and break stuff, they see accessibility as like an extra layer and not cooked in and they put it caked on. And I think once you stop and you say experience design, like user design is important, like this can't suck and it also has to be accessible. I think those kinds of things to me root down the dreamers who just want to like run and just build something and throw it out to the ether because there are things that need to be considered. There's process, and I would say same thing with security and safety. Those people are like pumping the brakes and saying like, hey, this is rad, but you need to think about X, Y, and Z. So when it comes to like convincing someone that process is important, I don't have the answer to that. I really don't. I think what we got to the process we have because it was scaling so big we couldn't keep up without process. Like you'll drown without a process. And drowning is not great, especially in accessibility where all of us are so overworked. And then, on top of it just being too big, it gets sticky, especially when we're thinking about legalities. Like we need to track, like if a lawsuit comes up, which it's scary to think about. And like, obviously I don't want to be like doom and gloom, but like if a lawsuit comes up, they're going to come and look and see if that ticket was ignored. Did that ticket get posted? Why was that change made? Did you say, we'll work on this later? And it's documented that someone said this isn't a priority. And when you get sued about it, that stuff comes out and they're going to want that information. So it's a little bit of like a fear factor, but also just it's not scalable if you're not moving towards process. Best of luck. That's all I can say. Like if you put me into a brand new program and said, Shell, build process and convince people, I would struggle. Like that's not something I have the skills to do. So if you are in that situation, my heart goes out to you for real, because it's a tough place to be in. My best advice is to advocate for efficiency, and that is process.
Um, see, I'm looking to see what we have through chat. There's one other that's come in that I think is, yeah, it is more specific to your talk. There are a couple of other general ones if we have time we
Okay.
can put on. Do you have a go-to guide for accessible design specs?
Go-to times. A place that I find myself looking frequently is BBC's design system Gel. Great example. They have everybody who's worked on that amazing. So sometimes when I'm like, is this right? I will check out Gel and see what they're up to. That's one place I definitely go to. And then um, a blog that I really religiously use is Sherry Breinhaber. I'm so sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I obsessed with their work. I have definitely been on their blog posts several times being like, I don't know what I'm doing. And then, finding that and being like, oh, thank God. So those are two of my go-tos. And also I think for me, a huge thing too is asking other advocates, asking other accessibility specialists. I'm privileged enough to say like Eric Bailey helped me with this talk, and so did Devin Persing, and I had Sarah Higley on here. I talked to Anna Cook. Like, I have the privilege to be tapped in. But Twitter's a great resource. I find so many answers on Twitter, and there's also I don't use Slack personally, but there is an accessibility Slack as well where people can go and ask questions to get help from experts. I can't do Slack, but it is a great place to go get resources as well, and especially like it's even validating. Where I struggled with the most was even validating to have someone say, I don't know the answer. Like that's so validating to be like, okay, it's not just me, especially when you're working in like, I did a lot of mobile accessibility and there's not a lot of answers for a lot of the problems that I dealt with. And just hearing from other experts, yeah, I have no idea, that's really tough, is so validating, like even that alone. So those are my recommendations.
I feel like a lot of the work is validation, no matter how much you've been doing it. When you hear someone else who
Yeah.
you look at as an expert, when people are looking at you as an expert,
Yeah.
and they validate something, it's like no matter how far you move in this space, and I think this is probably true in other spaces, that's constantly true. I think
Mm-hmm.
for almost all of us.
Yeah.
So a little bit, and we just have time for maybe one or two more.
Mm-hmm.
More generally speaking, which do you prefer for cognitive comprehension text, Hemingway or Grammarly?
I'm a Grammarly user personally. I've never used the other product. Maybe I should check it out. For me, I have dyslexia and a lot of other fun brain stuff, and I rely heavily on things like Grammarly. I could not give you a recommendation for the other one, but I do know I get a little bit grumpy about some of their user interface, but in general, I do think that Grammarly, for me as a sighted person who can perceive color, I do think it is a product that I use. I don't know if this is like a personal question or like a work question, because like I've never used Grammarly in my work before, only just like emails and writing stuff. So
Right.
hopefully that answers your question.